right, hey y'all, this is Corinne.
And this is Ayani.
And this episode requires a little bit of an explanation and introduction. So, in preparation for this year's Young Adult Studies Association conference, at which Ayani and I are once again presenting, we are releasing our presentation from last time we presented.
Yeah, that's accurate. So, because Corinne and I are nothing if not predictable, we are actually presenting kind of on the same text twice. Our first presentation for YASA was about Lore Olympus, the webtoon by Rachel Smythe, in which we talked about the allure of Hades, why he's hot and why he is an attractive male lead in the story. And our second presentation, which will be released shortly after this one, I think maybe about a week or so is the plan, is going to be thinking about Lore Olympus in the context of YA stories, asking the question and kind of trying to answer if we think Lore Olympus is a YA text.
Yeah, so as a treat, here is a little bit of a blast from the past. It is an episode that we recorded 2 years ago now, so enjoy and and if you want...
No, I was just going to say, as a quick note, we kind of leaned into the academic side of things with this one.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll notice our tone is a little bit different, perhaps, than other episodes that you've listened to. If you're unfamiliar with what a conference presentation is or how they function, we actually gave a pretty handy introduction to kind of conferencing in our episode on Tamora Pierce that we did, that I will link in the show notes for your reference.
But yeah, thanks for listening. And if you would also like to let us know why Hades is so hot, don't forget to find us on social media.
At Sex Love Lit, of course, in all of those various places. All right, enjoy the show.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks for listening to our talk. This is 30% Scoundrel, the Allure of Hades and Lore Olympus. To introduce ourselves, I'm Corinne.
And I'm Ayani.
And we are both PhD candidates at the University of Florida. To sort of give you an idea about what we're talking about and why we're talking about it together, I specialize in children's and young adult literature, and
I specialize in comics and animation studies. A lot of my research right now is focused on monsters, monstrosity, and desire, which is part of the reason why I'm here talking about Lore Olympus.
And my research focuses on consent and sexuality and gender in young adult speculative fiction. So when Ayani turned me on to this comic, Lore Olympus, that we'll be talking about today, it seemed like a perfect intersection of what we both study and like a great topic to bring to YASA, because it is such an unconventional piece of what we consider to be young adult literature.
So just as a note, this presentation is going to be a bit non-traditional, let's say. We are going to be leaning a bit more on the discussion side of things in the vein of the podcast that Corinne and I actually have together called Sex, Love, Literature, which you can find a lot of places. But in that vein, we are going to, of course, have images that we're showing you, but we're definitely going to have more of a back and forth about some important points having to do with Lore Olympus. But our main point that we are going to be kind of critiquing and thinking about is, why is Hades so hot in Lore Olympus? Why is he so attractive? Why can't we get enough of Hades? Why can't a lot of people get enough of Hades? So I guess we can go ahead and get started, Corinne. Should I jump into here? All right, fantastic. I hope you guys enjoy our fun little discussion. For some context, Lore Olympus is a romance webcomic that is illustrated and written by Rachel Smythe and is published on the Webtoon platform. Webtoon is a super, super popular comic platform that was initially launched, I believe, in Korea, but in the last 6 years, has kind of spread to wide international acclaim. There are even some webtoons that are now being produced as animated features for Crunchyroll, which is a animation platform, streaming platform, I should say.
And there are also a lot of webtoons that have been adapted into Korean dramas as well that you can find on Netflix.
So yeah, the webtoon has literally exploded in a lot of, or I guess figuratively exploded in a lot of ways across the globe. And there's a lot of great content on there, including Lore Olympus. So Lore Olympus began publishing weekly back in March of 2018. I think I personally picked it up a little after that and have been reading for about 2 years now, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And then I picked it up about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, on Ayani's recommendation.
Yeah, and we are not alone. Lore Olympus is currently one of the most popular webcomics on the Webtoon platform. As of August 2020, it was reported to have 4.1 million subscribers across the globe. Speaking of things being picked up for animation, Lore Olympus has actually been optioned by the Jim Henson Company. So I believe there is an animated adaptation in the works right now, which of course I'm also very, very excited about. But for some story context, Lore Olympus is a retelling of the Hades and Persephone myth, but with a mostly modern twist. So the gods, when we see them in Olympus or in the underworld, live in a very, very modern scenescape with cell phones and cars and fantastic suits and beautiful hairstyles, while the humans in the world, when we go to like the human mortal realm, still are in kind of ancient Greece, so to speak. So we're getting the togas, we're getting, people tilling the fields with sickles. It's very much, it's there's that kind of dramatic time difference that I think makes the story incredibly interesting.
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of critical conversations that our discussion are adjacent to or sort of take part in, including sex and romance in young adult literature, webcomics and comic studies more generally, fairy tale, folklore, mythology retellings, which, as I'm sure many of you know, are very, very popular in YA these days. It's also related to consent and the hashtag #MeToo movement and the question of sexy devils and monstrosity studies. Which, when you put those last two things together, which are Ayani and Mai's interest, you get consensual monster sex, which is what brings us here today.
What could be better than consensual monster sex? Am I right?
Absolutely nothing, obviously.
Nothing at all. But to give you a little bit of a roadmap of the conversation to come, our deep dive into consensual monster sex, the first thing we'll be thinking about it's kind of a conversation of dark princes and how Hades fits into some of these tropes and trappings of the dark prince character archetype. From there, we're going to be thinking about power dynamics and consent and how both are at work in Lore Olympus as a whole. And finally, we'll be thinking a bit about fan reactions and fan community in terms of Lore Olympus. One of the things that's wonderful, or fun, let's say, at the very least, about Webtoon is that there's a constant stream of comments that you can look at and read about the work, which makes it a very interesting platform. But we will get to that a little later in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. And then to also give you an overview of the important characters that we'll be talking about, obviously there's a whole pantheon of gods that show up intermittently in the story. But the three main ones that are important here are Persephone, who is delightful. She's tiny and she's pink and she's very, very cute. But she's also 18 or 19. She's in her first year of college. She's left home for the first time. And that she's a big part of what gives this comic sort of YA vibes. We'll also be talking about Apollo, who is kind of an asshole. He's
definitely an asshole.
Definitely an asshole. He's ancient and he's purple. So the gods and goddesses here are like drawn in different colors, sort of a la the Disney Hercules movie. But Apollo, importantly to our discussion, sexually assaults Persephone pretty early on. So content warning, that is something that we will be thinking about in our presentation. And then the last big character we'll be talking about is Hades, who is blue. He is 2,000 plus years old, and he's, the king of the underworld. He is a slick businessman, but also looks great in a sweatshirt or, without a shirt at all. So I'm going to turn it over to Ayani to talk about Hades as a dark prince.
Sure. So thinking a bit about dark princes and our attraction to dark princes is a portion of my dissertation. there have been dark princes throughout YA media for a very, very long time. I'm sure a lot of you, as soon as you hear dark prince, you think, vampires, Edward, Twilight.
Although I hope for your sake you think of things besides Twilight.
Yes, of course. But in the vein of Twilight, these kinds of dark princes, these bad boys, these moody boys are character figures and character archetypes that have appeared across time, across genres, but they have a particular stronghold in romance. There are a lot of ideas about why these characters have such an appeal. Sometimes there are thoughts that it's the power that being with these kinds of characters can bring. Sometimes it's the thought of uncovering something beneath the hardened exterior of a dark prince, to find the soft nugget underneath. But there is an undeniable draw to these kinds of characters. Case in point, there's something very particular about the king of the underworld, about Hades, or even about Lucifer, if we want to pull him in there, that people are very attracted to. For example, Lucifer on Netflix, which just released its 5th season. People are wild about that show. People love the character of Lucifer Morningstar in that show. Though, of course, that's a little bit different since our Hades here is drawn versus an actor. There is a new game that just came out called Hades, I believe. That's a dungeon crawler in which the internet is going insane over the characters. It's nuts. I keep seeing it on my feed where people are like, I got this game because I thought it would be cool. I stayed for the hot gods. So there is this kind of trend of drawing Hades as desirable and as attractive. But something that's worth thinking about in Lore Olympus is, what is it that makes Hades attractive? Of course, attractiveness is subjective, but in a romance story like Lore Olympus, you do want your readers of all kinds to find your male lead, to find your romantic lead, to be interesting, to be attractive, to be somebody that they could visualize themselves with, even if he is a giant blue old man, right? So one of the things we wanted to open up the conversation to talk a bit about was the sexualized gaze. I, for one, and this might be a spicy hot take here, but I think it's worth thinking about not a flattened sexualized gaze, but an open sexualized gaze. That there are a variety of different types of people who are going to be looking at Hades with desiring intent. I don't want to just say, it's a female gaze, right? Because that, in a way, can take or remove certain styles of gazes from the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's too limiting to just think of that.
Right. So, thank you. So, kind of opening this up to a sexualized gaze, Hades is often shown in a variety of very attractive moments, let's say.
He very conveniently has a swimming pool in his house, so we, get to see him swimming frequently.
But yeah, he's frequently shown working out. We've seen him running. We see him swimming. We see him shirtless. There are often even pinup style panels that he's featured in. And there are quite a few panels in which he returns the gaze of the viewer seductively and suggestively. So creating that connection between the figure that is being looked at and the viewer who is doing the looking, right? There's a lot of pleasure in the look in Lore Olympus. As a comic, it's making great use of that. And also thinking of the sexualized gaze, we kind of pointed to this a little bit in thinking about Hades and his swimming pool. But there are so many different costumes that they put this man in to get kind of a full range of, I guess, desiring images, let's say, let's call them. Corinne, what are some of your favorite Hades outfits that we see?
So, of course, there's like the Hades and like the suit, because, a man in a suit is a time-honored tradition. But I think my personal favorite Hades look is actually Hades in a sweatshirt.
That's a really good
and,
one.
Like, the more casual look.
Yeah. It was funny because I think the shirt says Underworld Con 96, right? So
it's kind of like the boyfriend look.
And on top of that, it's a nerdy t-shirt because he was at a convention. So extra points for that. There's also, of course, the Hades in traditional Roman garb.
Mm-hmm.
That was a favorite in some of the comment sections that we'll come back to. So yeah, in a way, it's kind of the versatility of Hades that makes him attractive, that he can be comfortable in his sweatshirt at home, comforting you while still being a sexy businessman, you know, the head
Mm-hmm.
of the underworld, so to speak. But Hades also has a sense of gentleness and safety to him, which is
Mm-hmm.
very important. So, stepping away from the sexualized gaze itself, specifically, the way that Hades is characterized is as somebody who cares about living creatures, which is interesting to say as the god of the underworld, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
believe he has like 9 dogs.
He has a collection of varied rescue dogs.
Yes, they are rescue dogs, right? A lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Along with Cerberus, of course. He picks up another dog over the course of the first volume of Lore Olympus.
Mm-hmm.
He is shown to be kind and caring to other characters, especially in his relationship with Persephone.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and there are also moments of weakness that we see in Hades that are very
Mm-hmm.
important. This is kind of leaning into the dark print, so to speak. Yes, of course, he is the king of the underworld. There's that literal darkness of the underworld there. But he also has a quote unquote sad backstory, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, in which we are allowed to empathize with Hades rather than just looking at Hades.
Mm-hmm.
We get to know him as a well-rounded character rather than just as a a slab of comic meat for us to look at, right? He is a point of view character almost just as much as Persephone is.
Mm-hmm.
So we get to see him through his own perspective, but also see him through her eyes, which opens up kind of an understanding of the character that's broader than just if we were seeing the whole thing through Persephone's perception or just through Hades' perception. So there are in a lot of ways, this comic does play into a variety of romance tropes, right? A lot of familiar romance tropes that romance readers will have an understanding of and be comfortable with. Like, for example, the meet cute. There's, of course, meet cutes there, but it's been adapted to a new medium, or rather, not a new medium. Comics have been around forever, right? But continuing to adapt and build on how these tropes can work when you add different layers, when you add different ways of expression, and when you're working with pictures, because pictures make everything better.
Good deal. But sort of then moving into one of the layers that makes Hades so attractive, and is the reason that I, in particular, am interested in this comic. There's the question of power dynamics and consent, and consistently, one of the things that I noticed in this in the comment sections of this comment, is that one of the things that makes Hades so attractive to readers is that he understands and respects consent, which is, you know, very important, kind of a hot button topic right now, as it should have been for a while, but. So this is kind of an interesting topic to think about because on the surface and in many Hades and Persephone myth retellings, they have a very uneven power dynamic. Hades is thousands of years old. Persephone is 19. When I read this comic with some of my students, they were, in fact, especially when the comic began, very, very uncomfortable with that. They got a lot of Bella and Edward vibes from it,
Mhm.
and it made them very uncomfortable. Another thing that potentially makes their power dynamic very problematic is the workplace romance, because over the course of the story, pretty quickly, Persephone starts an internship in the underworld that Hera kind of sets up because she's sneaky like that. Uh, she's not that sneaky. She kind of has the subtlety of a rock. But
Still wonderful.
but what that ultimately means then is that Hades is Persephone's boss. So that's also another layer that is potentially very, very uncomfortable.
Mhm.
But Smythe, I think, and I think Ayani agrees, is very, very
Mm.
aware of this as a potential problem
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
addresses and mitigates the power dynamics in Hades and Persephone's relationship in a number of ways.
Mhm.
One of the most important ways she does this is by showing that Hades and Persephone are both very, very aware of it. It's a subject of conversation in the comic itself. Hades is very, very careful. Like, he has a whole panic attack when he, like, realizes how much older he is than Persephone, and, like, that it's, like, not appropriate. So, but, like, because of that realization, he, like, asks her what her boundaries are. He's very respectful of them. He's very, very careful not to cross those lines. He's very careful about not making Persephone do anything she doesn't want to do. But then also on the flip side of that, Persephone is a powerful goddess in her own right. She's not just, even though there is particularly at the beginning of the comic a tendency of readers to refer to Persephone as like a sweet little cinnamon roll, which, you know, she kind of is. She also is the goddess of spring and can hold her own and has the agency to make her own decisions. Another thing that Smythe does is set up Hades directly in contrast to Apollo. Traditionally, Apollo is sort of like a Prince Charming kind of god. He's very handsome. He's younger than Hades, because, you know, Hades is one of the original three. Apollo is of, like, the next generation of gods. And he is, on the surface, more of an quote-unquote appropriate match for Persephone. They seem more like peers. He's her roommate. So Persephone is living with Artemis, so he's her roommate's brother. And it seems like it should be something that is more appropriate. However, Apollo is a rapist. So he uses that position to coerce Persephone into sleeping with him, something that she is not comfortable with, something that she doesn't consent to, and something that I think that I talk about in my research elsewhere, that Smythe is very careful about, is she's not depicting this as sort of like a clear-cut, obvious stranger danger rape kind of situation, which is often referred to as, quote, the real rape script by sociologists, which is largely a myth. Instead, it's an acquaintance rape situation in which Apollo is over hanging out and, like, sneaks into Persephone's bedroom and, like, acts like Persephone wants this, so much so that, like, she isn't sure. Like, she doesn't ever say yes, but she never, like yells no and fights him off. But the comic, both through Persephone and Eros and a number of other characters' point of view, is very, very clear that this was sexual assault.
Yeah, can I actually jump in here really quickly? Yeah. Something that I loved about that sequence, which sounds like a really weird thing to say, but I think Smythe does a really good job of letting us know what's happening without forcing us to be there for that very difficult, visceral moment. During that sequence, Persephone kind of escapes into her own mind, as a way of showing us that there is something uncomfortable and dangerous, maybe even, that's happening to her in this moment, without us having to, again, be forced to look and witness, which I think is really important to mention, because this is something that a lot of shows, books, and movies don't do. They force you to kind of live through these very upsetting sequences as a way to, like, drive the point home or whatever.
Well, and, like, there is this larger question of, is it necessary in depictions of trauma to also traumatize the reader? I know Kenneth Kidd has asked this question in relation to Holocaust literature, particularly for children. And this is, I think, a larger question in relation to trauma and particularly sexual assault in YA in general. And is a question that Gwen Tarbox brings up in her recent book on children's and young adult comic books and graphic novels, about, like, how much does having it shown increase the trauma and then make something inappropriate for children or young adult readers.
Right.
Moving away from Apollo for a minute and moving back to Hades, who we're here to really talk about. Hades is set up in opposition to Apollo. So even in the situation in which Hades on the surface has much, much more power than Persephone, he does not use that power to manipulate her into doing things that he wants her to do. He wants her to make her own choices. He doesn't want something that's inappropriate. Like, there's even a moment where Zeus, because Zeus is the worst,
Mhm.
proposes that Hades just kidnap Persephone and marry her, you know, in an allusion to the actual myth. And Hades is like, absolutely not. I will absolutely not do that. But something that this also does, really interestingly, is speculative fiction here, is allowing us to think about how power, which is so fantastically unequal in this fantastic setting, is also always unequal in real life, no matter
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
we do to mitigate it. So it's thinking about ways to negotiate that power differential in ways that can still respect consent and affirmative consent and mutual consent and all the aspects of consent that are important.
Excellent. So moving on to our final point of the podcast presentation,
Mhm.
thinking a bit about fan reactions and fan community. So, as I mentioned previously or earlier, Corinne and I are not the only ones reading this comic. She actually, to speak for Corinne, actually had two of her friends power through the entirety of Lore Olympus, like what, last week?
Yeah,
For no
like
reason.
out of the blue. Like I mentioned that we were doing this presentation and they both messaged me the next day being like, I stayed up until 2 a.m. finishing it. Which, as a note, you can't finish it because it's ongoing. You can just
Right.
catch up.
Which is really important in thinking about fan reaction and fan community. Because Lore Olympus does update weekly, Sundays is the normal update
Mhm.
day. Some people can quote unquote fast pass to read the new episodes earlier, but the episodes release for free on Sunday early morning, which gives readers a chance to not only intake the new content, but have reactions to said content
Mhm.
almost in real time, pretty much, which makes for a very, very interesting opportunity to see how readers, how audiences are reacting to the episode, to the content in real time, right? These are immediate reactions to things. So while on one hand, I might just text Corinne and be like, oh my God, girl, did you read the new episode this Sunday? Other readers will share their responses with a
Mhm.
wider audience. And this is actually something that is very interesting to think about kind of in the larger conversation of web media and the access that
Mhm.
fans and audiences have to creators that was not possible at the same level before the internet, right? I follow a lot of my favorite authors and illustrators on Twitter and can be like, that made me really happy. Thank you for existing, which I couldn't do, 20 years ago. So thinking about how fans are communicating with their creators, thinking about how this speaks to the world that certain stories are introduced into. But also, and this is not necessarily the subject of this presentation, but how sometimes because of this easy access, fans and fan communities will feel a certain kind of ownership
Mhm.
over the works that are being produced. But one of the things we found very interesting were people's very, very positive reactions to Hades.
Mhm.
Um, in a way that kind of affirmed for us that this wasn't just us being like, wow, this blue man's kind of hot. There are other reactions that fans have had in the comments to Hades specifically. So, for example, there is one comment in which we see, in this is in reference to seeing Hades in a toga. That fan or commenter Faith and Fate in 2019 commented, if Hades' robe was any shorter, no one would be complaining about the shortness of this chapter. Ha ha. So right there's already kind of the connection between Hades and desire, between fan reactions and desire for Hades, but also the fact that there is sometimes I don't want to say disappointment, that might be too strong, but an expectation of the
Mhm.
length of content that's being received, how long episodes are, how much information we're getting per episode.
Mhm.
And that was also an episode where they were shown with realistic skin colors for the first time, so not blue, but various shades of brown, which was, I thought it was a nice touch, a very
Mhm.
interesting episode. Um,
And maybe another example of some reader comments that in helped to spark this presentation. So back in 2018, at the sort of the beginning of the comic, there's a situation where Persephone is set up to be, she's left in Hades' car drunk. It's very not cool. And, it's Aphrodite pulling some trash. It's not cool. But like the reader comments then are very interesting. So KD Reader 02 comments, goodness, Hades has to be one of the best gentlemen in all of webtoons. He's seriously raising the standards for male romance leads. And then Howl's Castle Moved also comments, okay, let's talk about consent and how Hades follows it. She's drunk and he doesn't take advantage of her. Take notes, people, take notes. And then the take notes, people is in all caps. So, like, there is this conversation here correlating being a gentleman and respecting consent. So there's sort of, this is drawing on ideas about chivalry. This is drawing on ideas about, like, appropriate behavior and what kind of behavior in a romance lead is attractive.
Yeah. And I'm going to just drop a bomb and then run away. In some of my reading about romance, there is a lot of conversation about rape as a kind of desire in controlled spaces. Yeah, which is questionable, which I will talk more about in my dissertation, not in this presentation right now. But I do think this is an interesting kind of inversion of that, saying that the fantasy here, the thing that the audience is most engaged with, is the fact that Hades was a total gentleman, that there you can be drunk in somebody's car and just wake up fine and safe in the morning. There is that kind of, I don't know, happiness doesn't seem like the right word, but that kind of appreciation of a character that would do that and behave in that way, when many women do not feel that sense of safety in reality and in real lived experience.
Yeah, there is. So to really quickly, in this comic, an acknowledgement, I think, of rape culture in a way that is often missing from depictions of sexual assault in YA, because it becomes such an individual experience instead of an acknowledgement about the culture that makes it possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And in a way, something that Greek gods are kind of primed to do, to have these conversations about rape culture. I mean, we're not talking a lot about Zeus here, but he's also kind of a jerk.
He also sticks up for Apollo in a way that's so maddening.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like the majority of Zeus's relationships that are shown in the comic are consensual. But
there's still that undertone, that undertone that readers know about Zeus being the worst.
Right. And on top of that, both he and Apollo are purple. So there is a kind of correlation that happens there between the purple men. One last comment on fan reactions and fan community, and then we'll kind of wrap up here, because I think we might be going on a little longer than we're supposed to. But we hope you're having fun, so rock out with the length. But one of the things that the fan community has done is dubbed Apollo Asspollo. So ass and then Paulo. I'm not sure the first time I read that in the comments, but that is what I've called him ever since. I have only not called him that for the sake of this presentation, because it's technically a presentation. But when we talk about Lore Olympus in our day-to-day lives, Asspollo is what I call him. So there is this kind of interesting question of the global comics community here. How I think I've run into people on the street and talked about Lore Olympus and then been like, oh, Asspollo, right? And they're like, yeah, Asspollo. So, I think there's a lot more that could be dived into here. It's not a real phrase, but we'll rock with it. A lot more that could be poked at here in terms of fan reaction in Webtoon that we just do not have time to unpack today. But I hope somebody will pick up that mantle and kind of run with it, because it's super interesting.
So to conclude, thanks for listening to our presentation and bearing with us. But one of the things that we hope you leave this discussion with is the understanding that the question of, like, what is young adult literature and what it can be is really a big one, and that a webcomic, a serial webcomic produced weekly, is just as much a part of the conversation of YA as Speak or as Forever, like your more classic YA text, and can address some of the same questions in interesting and unique ways.
And if you decide to power through Lore Olympus in one evening, definitely feel free to get in touch with us. We love talking about Lore Olympus, as you can see from this presentation. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it as much as you've enjoyed hanging out with us.
Yeah, thanks so much. And if you wanted to look up our podcast or to just tell us what you think about Lore Olympus, you can find us on Instagram at the handle SexLoveLit. Make sure you write the whole name. Otherwise, you might find some stuff you weren't planning to find.
And we're also on Twitter as well.
All right. Thanks and have a great day.
Take care.